Okay, this video is going to demonstrate how to use Autodesk Inventor to create an iPart. iParts are commonly used in Inventor because you can take one common design and modify it so that you can get several parts that maybe have a common theme or a common design and nest them all into one part rather than having several different parts. They can all be one with one basic design. We're going to base this on the Simpson Strong-Tie Heavy Angle. Okay, so we're going to look at, for example, there's two here. There's the HL 53, the Heavy Angle 53, and the Heavy Angle 55. They're very similar. The only difference is the length and the number of holes. We're actually going to build 53, 55, 57, 73, 76, and 79 because they're all very similar. The things that are going to change as we look at this, down here at the bottom, you'll see that there's the gauge of the steel. So some of them are 7 gauge and some of them are 3 gauge. The sizes of the angles, 5 3/4 and 7 1/4. The length, the number of holes, and so on. Okay, so because they're very similar, though, we can put them all in there as one part. We're going to call it HL for heavy angle, and then we're going to create an iPart so that when we insert these into an assembly, we can just tell it which one we want. All right, so beginning in Inventor here, we're going to say we want to create a new part, but we don't just want a regular part. We want to make sure that we're creating a sheet metal part here. So make sure you have sheet metal chosen. By the way, I do have my sheet metal project file ready to go so that everything's good to go there. I say create, and so now I'm going to begin by just creating a sheet metal part. Remember, the first thing you want to do when you create your sheet metal part is to set up that sheet metal rule so that it kind of defines how everything is supposed to go. And we don't want to use default because default is lousy. It doesn't have the right thickness or anything. So I'm going to come in here and say change this, and I want to create two. We're going to create one called 3 gauge stainless, or excuse me, galvanized. And that 3 gauge galvanized is going to be the thicker one. Okay, so it's not regular, it's just regular steel alloy. Okay, and our thickness on that 3 gauge steel is 0.2391. For the bend, even though it's not going to affect it, we're going to change it to round, and for the same thing for the corner. So this doesn't have, it won't affect this part because it's a fairly simple part, but we're going to change those two to round and corner. And so there we go. So we can say, okay, save that one. So there's our 3 gauge galvanized. The thinner one is a 7 gauge. Oh, excuse me, this one isn't galvanized, it's steel. So let me rename this one, right click, and rename the style. It's not galvanized, it's just steel. Okay, the other one that we're going to create is galvanized, so it's going to be 7 gauge galvanized. Okay, and say okay there. And on the 7 gauge, it's galvanized steel, so I can come down here and pick that one. And then our thickness on that one is 0.1793. And say everything else will be the same. We got the round there, and on the corner we've got the round, so we're good. So we can say save and close. And then the one that we want to have current right now is the 7 gauge galvanized, so we'll set that one current and say okay. So at this point we can start creating our base feature, which for me is going to be that that horizontal flange. So if we come back over here, I'm going to start off by designing the HL53 with this horizontal flange. Okay, so W2 here, you'll see W1 and W2 are both 5 3/4. The length is 2.5. Okay, so I'm just getting that information right off the chart here, so I can just say, okay, let's take and put that information back over here. So using my rectangle command, I'll start from here and get it approximately the right size and shape, and then we'll dimension it. So this dimension right here is our length, and I'm going to name it here. So I'm going to say L is equal to 2.5. And what that does is it creates a named dimension inside of the parameters. And we'll look at that in just a minute. This one here is W2. So we'll say W2 is equal to 5 3/4. Okay, and set enter there. So now we're fully constrained. Just to look at the parameters tab, you'll see now that I've got L is 2.5 and W2 is 5 3/4. One of the keys to making iParts a little bit easier is to name the parameters that are going to change. And so the parameters that I name when I create them here are going to show up here, and then when I create my iParts, it's automatically going to bring them in. So it just makes your job a little bit easier. So now I can say, okay, let's finish this sketch, and I will use the face tool. It's already set up for 7-gauge galvanized, so we're good to go there. So there's our first one. The next thing we want to do now is create the other flange here. Okay, that other flange also has a length of 5 3/4. So I'm going to say that one is W1 is equal to 5 3/4. Notice that I can add that parameter name right here inside of this field on the flange dialog box. So I'll say, okay, that's the one that we want to bring there. And just make sure that you've got your bend position set up right here. So inside of bend face extents, and then where they intersect on the two outer faces, that's what we want for this one, so that it's 5 3/4 from the tip top to the bottom of that one, and from the edge of that to the back face there. We can say okay, and that creates our angle. The next thing we want to do is put our holes in there. And the easiest way for me to put holes in there is just to create a new sketch. So I'll put it on that, and then we'll use the point tool. So I'll say I need, a hole about there and a hole about there. We want to make sure that those are constrained horizontally to each other, and then we want to dimension them. So now this dimension from the edge here to the center here on the Simpson page, it's called D1. Okay, if I come back over to the Simpson page real quick, you'll see that it's called D1 there, it's called D1 there. But I don't want to call it D1 because I don't want to get confused with what Inventor is going to call it. Because remember, Inventor gives the dimension D names. So I'm going to call this one offset. Here we do it again. Dimension from the edge there to the edge there. I'll put it down. We're going to call it offset. And that is equal to 1 1/4 inches. Okay. And then the same thing here from the back to the first hole. I'm just going to call that one back offset. Can't put any spaces in there, so I just cram the two words together, is equal to 2. And then between, the distance between here from there to there is equal to 2.5. So I'll just click that down, and I'll just call it between is equal to 2.5. Okay, so we're fully constrained. Finish the sketch. I'm ready to put my holes in there now, so I go to hole, and it sees my two centers. It's going to put the hole in there. If I go back here, you'll notice that the diameter of the bolt is 1/2 inch, but you can't get a 1/2 inch bolt through a 1/2 inch hole. So what we're going to do is we're going to make that hole a little bit bigger. So 0.5625 is 9/16. And rather than just leave it like that, I'm going to call it DIA. Again, I'm naming this parameter, calling it DIA is equal to 0.5625, and say OK. So there we go on that one. And now because I'm lazy and I don't want to draw another sketch here, I'm just going to put a work plane in. I'm going to base that work plane so that it is halfway between the YZ and the XZ plane. Notice it comes in there at that angle. And then I can use my mirror, and I can say let's mirror those holes that I just created on that mirror plane. Okay. And then just turn the visibility of the plane off. It makes my life a whole lot easier. So there we go. That's our first part. I'm going to save this as heavy angle, so I'll call it HL, okay, for heavy angle. I'm not going to put the numbers in. It's like 55, 57. Not going to put any of that in right now because that's going to come up a little bit later. So I'll just hit enter, and we are ready now to create our iPart. So this is the base one that everything's going to be built off of, but now we're going to expand this and make our iPart. To do that, you simply go to the Manage tab and you choose the Create iPart tool. And when you do, it's going to bring up this dialog box here, and you'll see that it has all of these parameters over here that have keys, and they have keys on them because they're named. So, you know, the name was L, W2, W1, offset, back offset, between, diameter. Those are all of the keys that I created for this part. The only other one that we have is the sheet metal, the thickness, okay? And so if I go to the sheet metal tab, I want the thickness for 7 gauge galvanized to be over here as well. All right, so it's not going to show up here, but it will show up on the sheet metal one, and it does show up down here as well. Okay, so when we look at the second one, so HL53 is the one that I just drew. HL55 is pretty much all the same. It's still 7 gauge steel. Both W1 and W2 are both 5 3/4. But now here's the things that change. The length is 5, okay? D1 is still 1 1/4, but now there's another set of holes that are 2 1/2 inches apart. D3 and D4 are still the same. And of course the quantity of holes changes, but the size of the hole doesn't change. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to go back in and modify this. So looking at it now, this is this is that first one, but it's not called HL01, it's called HL53. So I'm going to rename it here, 53, and I'm also going to rename the part number. Just say OK to that. I'm going to rename the part number 53 as well. Okay, so everything is good on that one. So now what we want to do is we want to say, okay, to get the next one, we just right click and we say insert another row. And notice that it calls it HL54. But again, I'm just going to rename this because it's supposed to be 55. And this one will be 55. So now our length, the only thing is changing on this one, well, there's a few things. The first thing that changes is that length. It's not 2 1/2 inches long, but now it's 5 inches long. W1 and W2 are still the same. The offset is still 2 1/2 inches, okay? The back offset in between is still the same. What you'll see is missing is the number of holes, and we'll look at that in a second and choose OK. So now when I click OK, nothing changed here, but you'll notice on the browser that now we have this table over here. If I expand the table, you'll see that there are two options. There's HL53, which is the original one that we built, and now there's HL55, so this heavy angle 55. If I double click on this one, you'll see now that I've got a bigger angle. It's longer, okay? But what's wrong with this one? Well, the thing that's wrong with this one is it doesn't have those extra holes, right? So what we can do now is this is Inventor, we can modify the design at any time. So in order to do that, we'll go back to 3D Model tab, and I'll say, okay, let's create a rectangular pattern, okay? The pattern that I want to, or the thing that I want to pattern are the holes there and the holes there, okay? And the direction now is, if I pick that line, notice that it gives me an arrow pointing in this direction, okay? So we've got two things that can change here. We've got the column count, okay, which is 2 columns, okay? And then we've got the spacing between, okay? So sometimes it's going to have 1 column, sometimes it's going to have 2 columns, sometimes it's going to have 3 columns. And so this is going to change. So I'm going to give this one a name as well. I'm going to call it the NOC, for number of columns is equal to 2, okay? And this one here, that's going to change because on the bigger angles, it's a further distance here. So I'm going to call this one spacing. And instead of 1.0, it needs to be 2 1/2. So we'll change that to 2 1/2. Okay, and so now notice that everything looks good here. When I choose OK here, this all looks good. If I go back to my parameters here and just scroll down, you'll see now that I've got the number of columns and the spacing between them are 2 and 2.5. So we're all pretty much good to go there at this point, right? So now this one looks good. If I wanted to change it back, however, watch what happens when I change it back to the heavy angle 53. I'll double click here and I'm going to get this message. It says, hey, errors occurred while you were, doing this. And I say, okay, let's accept that. Well, if I look at it, it looks fine and dandy. However, if I look over here in the browser, you'll see that there's this eye. The little eye icon is to notify you, hey, there's something going on with this. And if I look at my rectangular pattern, see these holes are fine, but these holes, they show up in the middle of nowhere. And we don't want that because that's just poor design. So the reason they show up is because I changed it from the longer one to the shorter one. So what we need to do is now go back and modify our iPart so that it doesn't have those. So if I go to the Manage tab, go back to the iPart, notice that it doesn't have the number of holes, okay, or the number of columns and the spacing here, so I need to add those. So I'll just click the plus on the rectangular pattern. This one right here needs to get added over there, and this one right here needs to get added over there as well. Okay, so now we've got the number of columns and the spacing. Well, on HL53, this one only has one column, so I'm just going to change that 2 and turn it back to a 1. So I'll choose OK there. Notice that I choose OK there. My warning went away for the rectangular pattern because on the rectangular pattern it's just got one column, so we're good there. Okay, and now when I switch here, it switches back over and everything's good. So that takes care of HL53 and HL55. The last one for this first one that we have to build for the 7 gauge is 57. And the only thing that's going to change here is the number of columns is going to change so that there's 3 columns here. So again, we'll go back to Inventor. We'll say, let's look at this iPart, and I'll right click here and insert a new row. This one's called 57. Okay. And the only thing that changes on this one, okay, is the fact that now instead of 2 rows, there's going to be 3. Okay. So 57, and this one's also called 57. And then over here, this one's going to be 3 rows. And I'll say OK. And so that makes that good. So now I've got 3 over here, and when I click here, it's got 3 rows. Come on. Oh, I forgot to change the length of it. So let's come back over here. iPart. Our length now is not 5 inches, but on this one it's 7.5 inches. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we'll save that. And so now we go. So we got our one with 2 holes, 1 hole, and 3 holes. So we're all good to go there. So that's 53, 55, and 57. Now to finish out this part, what we want is we want to have 73, 76, and 79. Okay. So on those 3 now, the things that are changing is pretty much everything. We're changing to 3 gauge steel. We're changing the W1 and W2. We're changing the length to 3, 6, and 9. D1, which was our offset side. The D2, which is our back offset, or I mean our distance between. D3 is our back offset. This one's the spacing between, and then the number of holes. Okay, so everything is pretty much changing on this one. So I'll go back to Inventor, and I'm just going to go back to this one here and make that one current, and we'll say, okay, create an iPart. So now we want to add those others here, so I'll say, okay, let's right click on here and insert the row. And so notice that it inserted it there, and let me cancel that. I'm going to insert it at the bottom. So I'll right click here and I'll say insert the row. Okay, so now this one's HL73. So I'll change this one to 73 and okay, and make this one 73. Okay, so we've got 73, 76, and 79. Okay, This one is 3 gauge steel. I'm just going to make my way across the chart here. So 73, we got 3 gauge steel, so not 7 gauge galvanized, but 3 gauge steel. I want that on that one. Okay. The next thing that we're going to look at here is the W1 and W2 is 7 1/4. All right. So I'll say W1 is 7 1/4, 7.25, and W2 is 7.25, 7.25, and then continuing across, the length on the short one is 3. Okay, so the length on the short one is 3. Is 3 on the short one. The offset is going to be 1.5. Okay, the back offset on this one is 2 3/4. Okay, if we look at the back offset, that's the D3. Okay, so that's 2 3/4. The distance between is 3. Okay, so between is going to be 3. The diameter now isn't 9/16, but it's supposed to be bigger than a 3/4 inch hole. A 3/4 inch hole is not the right size for a 3/4 inch bolt, so I'll make it a little bit bigger. So a 3/4 inch hole is going to be 0.8125. That's a 13/16, 3 gauge steel. For this first one that's only 3 inches long, it's got 1, and the spacing doesn't matter. We can leave that one there. However, it will be 3 inches, so I'll go ahead and change it. It's going to be 3 inches on the rest of those. So I say OK, and notice now that I've got HL73 at the side over here, so if I double click on it, it makes the one that's now it's bigger, it's thicker, the legs are longer, okay, and so on. To add the other ones now, we just come back in here and we add in the rest of them. So I'll right click here, come on, right click, insert row. This one's going to be called 76. Okay, the length now is 6. On that one, the number of rows is 2. Okay, and then we want to insert another row. This one is 79. The length on this one is 9, and it has 3 rows of holes. So we can say OK. And so now notice now that we've got the 76 and the 79. Okay. So now nested in one part, we've got all of the different parts. They're all heavy angles, but I've got all my different model numbers here to choose from. That concludes how to make the iPart. The last thing you're going to do is when you save it, you can when you insert this into an assembly, you can specify which one you want it to be. So if I come in here now and I say I want to create a new assembly, I'll say new assembly. Here's my assembly. When it's time to place the part, notice that I've got this heavy angle, okay, and it looks like that. But when I go to insert it, it brings up a dialog box. And it says, which one do I want? Okay, well, if I go to the table, here's all of my parts. So if I wanted heavy angle 76, I could do that one. And then right click and say, place it grounded at origin or whatever it happens to be. And I place that first one grounded at the origin, or I can place any other as any place that I want. If I wanted to place one of a different size, again, same thing. I can come in here and I say, go to the table, and let's say I just want, this one here, that shorty, the little one. I can say, okay, I can put those wherever I want. Or if I wanted a 57, I can put those wherever I want. And notice that as I do so, it gives them all, I put 3 of those in, and then 53, 53, 57, 57. So it gives them, puts each one as a separate one, but they're all the same, based on the same part. And that concludes the video on how to create iParts.